Full. So 10 a.m. Fontainebleau time and 4 p.m. East Coast time. So very much welcome to the webinar. Today's guest, we have Amy Edmondson. Amy, if you're there, it would be great if you could kind of activate your camera and your microphone. Wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for coming. Also welcome to more than 300 people who have kind of obviously interested early in the morning or late in the evening. I think we have some people, lots of people from Singapore, from people from Australia. We have some people from the West Coast, so really of all different time zones. It's a great pleasure, Amy, to have you. There's the nice saying, compliments are boring, so I'm going to keep it short. You are a chair tenured professor at Harvard Business School, have been so for a while. I'll start with, I have one or two compliments, which I think, however, think are slightly different than the ones you normally get. I asked Bob Sutton, who I believe is a dear friend, to announce you at the last webinar. And Bob Sutton simply said, Amy Edmondson is simply the best, okay? Yeah. And there are lots of people who think Bob Sutton is simply the best. And so if Bob Sutton says Amy Edmondson is simply the best, I think it says a lot. I want to emphasize one or two more things beyond all your accomplishments in terms of academics and practical impact. I had the chance to interact with a few of your doctoral students a little bit more closely. I know Melissa, I know Jim, I obviously know Henrik Bressman, who's faculty at INSEAD, Mike Lee, who's also faculty at INSEAD, Ethan Bernstein is a close friend, Bradley Stats. All of those speak highly of you. You had a huge impact on these people. You're not always showing up as a co-author, which in many ways gives you even more credit to really kind of enable them to have your own career. On behalf of them, thanks to you, but also kudos for what you've done. And then there's one compliment that I will only be able probably to make to one other management school professor we have in this podcast, and I think it's a very special one. I honestly believe, and I think it's fair to say, that your work has actually saved lives. There are lots of people who have kind of helped people to get richer or to be better managers or different things. But your work has literally saved lives. And I think there's a lot of kind of work on the role of business schools and what business schools do and how business schools can help or not help or make the world a better or worse place. But it's very hard to actually read the book or to kind of reflect on what Amy has done and not to realize, look, this has literally saved lives. Not only has it made organizations better, more profitable, more efficient, blah, 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 but there are lots of people who are alive today because of the impact her work and her co-authors and the whole community which has emerged has done. So on behalf of everyone, thanks so much. We are going to talk about your book. The book is fantastic. I highly recommend the book. The book is helpful for yourself. It's a little bit, there are self-help aspects about it. I couldn't help for the last few weeks and kind of see all kinds of mistakes that are happening in my life. And so like, this is what so I feel I had a little Amy on my shoulder who would have said like, look, I could have told you. It's very helpful for your organization. So it's a book that is good for everyone. It's particularly good for managers. Beyond the topic of like psychological safety, how to fail in the right way, it's also a pleasure to read. You simply learn a lot about the scientific endeavor, how science kind of takes place, how medical innovation takes place. It's also great fun. You know, you learn about Amy's failed career as a basketball player and Amy's kind of so-so career as a sailor. So it's simply, you're going a little bit with a journey with Amy on a journey through her kind of scientific and practical impact. So it's simply been a joy. So thank you so much. Rather than me talking about the book, Amy, maybe you can give like a short summary, what this is about, what motivated you, what the book says.
Wow, Henning, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to be much good for anything right now after that introduction. I'm genuinely moved by it, and maybe you even saw just a little bit of suffering, not quite knowing how to respond. But that was really an unusual and lovely introduction in every way. So the book, I wrote this book because it bothered me how much really truly genuinely irrational talk there was out there, especially in business circles, about failure. And this, loosely described as the fail fast camp, the Silicon Valley happy talk, if you were, against the hold on, I live in the real world. Over here, failure's not acceptable, failure's off limits. And, seemingly two contradictory messages that weren't reconcilable. And of course, they are reconcilable when we take context into consideration. So I wanted to sort of describe the failure landscape as, failure is a big word, and it basically means an undesired result of some effort, some action. And it comes in, at least I described 3 flavors, and the 3 flavors, the 3 types, have very different implications for how much we should welcome those failures into our lives. So I wanted to kind of clarify that, and then to add on a little bit about how do we think better about failure? How do we think more clearly about context, about uncertainty? So this may be a book about failure, but really it's a book about how do you succeed in an uncertain context or an uncertain world? And part of the answer is you do everything in your power to prevent preventable failures. And you roll up your sleeves and realize you're going to have intelligent failures in new territory. And so the goal was just to kind of put a little bit of structure and some language into this rather sloppy, or at least confusing, discussion out there.
There's a nice saying about comedians with a lot of comedy comes from anger. And with certain kind of comedians, you can see that. You can see this with Larry David. You can see this with Bill Burr. Some people succeed in hiding it, but it very often comes from frustration. I feel you do a so-so job in hiding it in this book. One can feel that. One can feel that you're annoyed.
Yeah.
One can feel that you're bothered.
I'll say annoyed. Yes, I'll cop to annoyed, but I won't go so far as angry.
What's wrong with you see, like, everybody's talking about failure, right? Everybody's talking about failing fast and stuff like that. What's wrong with the general understanding of failure, Amy? What's lacking?
It's not nuanced. It lacks the distinctions that are truly essential to think about and act on to think about failure in the right way and act in uncertain territory in the right way. And I can point to examples where companies made, big, huge product launches, let's say, that failed, and the failure was utterly predictable had they just even done the basics of thinking that through.
Yeah.
And we can describe incentives and so forth that led that to happen. And some of those failures are what I'll call basic failures, really just a single and simple error of either of judgment or action. And others are what I'll call complex failures, but predictable complex failures. If you really thought through even just a little bit the various factors at play, you would know that wasn't going to work. And you could, in fact, dial down the ambition and learn a little bit more, and then have a subsequent success.
You see, like, you just used the word, which was for me kind of the most important note I took. You said the book is nuanced, and that is how I really felt about it. So I give you an example from a different context. An advice you very often hear in life is like, hey, don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness afterwards. And I feel like, wow, ask all the bank robbers how that went, right? That's not really good
Right.
advice. It's good
Sure,
advice
right.
if you get forgiveness, but very often you might not get forgiveness. So it's in many ways poor advice. And so you provide
or advice that's overly, I mean, it sounds overly general, and it only applies beautifully to certain contexts, but not others. Sorry.
Context. No, context is wonderful, because so much in this book is about context. You talk a lot about labs and about uncertain environments, and kind of say a little bit, a lot or a lot about the intersection of context and the tendency to fail.
Yes, well, the higher the uncertainty, the more likely failure is. And that's just kind of a logical and I think truthful statement, because we have less access to what will happen next with, I mean, by definition of uncertainty. And so if you're in a scientific laboratory, like a basic scientific laboratory, the whole endeavor is about trying to answer questions that haven't yet been answered. So there's enormous uncertainty about whether you'll be right. But of course, you do your homework, you try to articulate the very best hypothesis you can, given that uncertainty, and then you go ahead and experiment, and sometimes you're right, and more often you're wrong. So, however, that is not the same as saying you should just be kind of guessing or hypothesizing when, let's just say you're in your own kitchen trying to bake a cake. Follow the recipe, and if you follow the recipe carefully, you will probably end up with a very good cake, like a low uncertainty, where having the cake be inedible or terrible would not be an advance, would not bring us new knowledge.
There's one aspect and I like about the book, because I think there's a challenge that managers face, right? You see, like one learns about the necessity of failure. And on the one hand, you want to keep up the standards very high, right? You don't want to invite failure, right? You want to say, like, look, we are like a high performance organization, but at the same time, you want to have tolerance for failure. Can you say a little bit about how to manage that? How do I establish, on the one hand, very, very high standards, but on the other hand, also kind of encourage risk-taking and open for failure? How do I, that seems like a very slippery slope.
Yeah, I wouldn't think I think of it more as again, a nuanced aspect of context, right? So in fact, if you are a scientist in a laboratory, or working for a principal investigator scientist in a laboratory, high standards includes, if not centrally includes, the willingness to take risks, right? High standards means bold hypotheses, well-informed hypotheses. You've read the literature. That's certainly an aspect of high standards in that context. But in a sense, being willing to do things that are not just safe, right? I think good scientists sort of test safer propositions. Great scientists are testing ones that, if they're right, it'll be huge. If they're wrong, which is more likely, no real harm done. I mean, maybe some time and resources are invested in that. So high standards means something very different in a scientific laboratory than on an assembly plant. Or let's say if you're opening a new market, a new geographic market in your company, high standards, essentially what you want is for people to give it their all, recognizing that this is new territory. We haven't been here before. We don't exactly know what customers will like or not like. So we'll be sort of experimenting a little as we go. So I think high standards is not incompatible with saying some failures will happen. And in a scientific laboratory, high standards is compatible with saying a lot of failures will happen. I interviewed one scientist who said 90% of the experiments in my lab fail, and she was a very successful scientist running a successful lab. So, and then if you go over to the Toyota production plant, it is the case that nearly everything goes according to plan, right? It's so high standards.
But everybody can pull the band.
Everybody can pull,
yeah.
And they're pulling to make sure we hit our own high standards for quality. So I think what high standards means is a commitment and an internal sense of ownership, a commitment to excellence, right? A commitment to doing our very best in terms of the goals we have assigned ourselves. It doesn't mean failure-free performance. It may be failure-free performance in very routine settings, but it does not mean failure-free performance in all settings.
I had a question about this, Amy, and so when you in the chapter where you write about the Toyota assembly system, I thought of a study of Oliver Schilke and me, and I wondered if this is relevant. So Oliver and Schilke and I, we have written this paper in organization science, where we say, look, if you have a threshold where just one person in an organization can trigger an action, that person is unlikely to trigger that action. because like suddenly the whole responsibility is on that person. And so we did an experiment where we said, like, you know what, if two people actually, everybody decides individually, but two people individually come up with the same thing and trigger an action, then the organization takes the action. So you see, like to say, like everybody can stop the assembly line in a certain way creates quite a bit of burden and responsibility on that person. Oh my God, you stopped the assembly line.
Yeah.
But everyone had like a secret button to say like, hey, if you press that button, the assembly, and one other person also presses that button, the assembly line is stopped. I wondered if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah.
I want to take a little bit the burden away from
the burden. I like that word, and I think it's right. And what you just described, and the study reminds me a little bit of the famous ASH experiments, where where participants in a lab, subjects in a lab, would find themselves not only agreeing, but actually somehow cognitively convinced that a line that was, visibly longer than another line was in fact shorter, because the majority was saying that, right? So there is something about our susceptibility to, we just don't want to be alone in some. If we're the only one who sees it, we'll start doubting ourselves. So that is a kind of a burden. I think what the way Toyota, and I would argue well-run healthcare centers and other well-run organizations overcome that potential psychological burden is by getting out ahead of it with the right framing, which is sort of the framing that says, we are dependent on you. We need you, right? You are the eyes and ears for the quality, for the customer. And, and without your earnest attention and willingness to speak up in the face of doubt, we can't do our aspiration of delivering these, high quality vehicles to our customers. Or we can't take, healthcare is a complex, error-prone system without your willingness to pull the cord at any time, and it's absolutely fine if 9 times out of 10 you're wrong, but it is still essential to our mission of providing safe care.
You have this beautiful anecdote of the website. I forgot the exact name of the Affordable Care Act, when the healthcare website actually came out, and one person reports a failure, and the leader of the initiative completely embraces it and says like, hey, I'm so glad you report this. So there's an encouragement in doing this.
You get a reward rather than a kind of implicit or explicit punishment.
So Amy, I would like to go, this goes back to kind of your early kind of dissertation work, but I think it's almost more beautifully illustrated in your interaction you had with a bunch of investment bankers. Where they and there's this beautiful line in the book, which to me, this was like, that's my favorite. This is my favorite line in the book, where you say these errors don't. If you're not tolerant for failures as managers, the errors don't disappear; they go underground. And that was really like, how should I say? It was for me something where I said like, okay, that makes. I knew this. I knew that there's a but it made it so salient to say there's not that you need to differentiate between actual errors and reported errors. And if you are not willing to accept reported errors, you will just get more unreported errors.
Yes.
I've seen lots of incidences about this.
Yes. I mean, of course, as you allude to, I first saw that pattern in a hospital study, in a hospital setting, where, I mean, I had the surprise finding that, that sort of well-trained and well-intentioned people were going around collecting data from caregivers on errors. And I believed going in, as did everybody else, that would give us a really good estimate of the actual error rate. And it was only the sort of discovery of wildly different rates. And I've never said it quite this way before, and it's not even in the book, but it's in the paper I wrote, but from the highest to the lowest error rate was a 10x difference, which, on the face of it, just, it can't be a tenfold competence different across units in the same hospital. So that was one signal. It wasn't quite enough to hit me over the head with it, but it was one signal that we may be seeing reporting biases based on sort of the work environment in these different units.
Without taking anything away from what you did, I always wondered how you figured this out. But the 10x difference explains it.
That was one of the little clues, right? It took, I mean, I had to see several of them to kind of see it, but that was actually one more in the, once I thought that might be going on, then I noticed that it's like, oh, I mean, how on earth could it be a tenfold difference in competence? It just doesn't make sense to me. I suppose even a tenfold difference in kind of sloppiness didn't make any sense to me. So, but I do like that line, and I'm glad you liked it too, because it can be something of an aha moment for senior executives. And I think the reason it can be an aha moment, and by the line, I mean the line you quoted, which is sort of that, having these, okay, no failures around here. This is a failure-free zone. Doesn't make them go away. It just makes them go underground. And I think the reason this can be sort of a moment of insight is because many managers are unaware of the degree to which they have taken for granted mental models that are vestiges of the industrial era. That there's a sort of taken for granted sense that performance is simple. Performance will be good when people try hard, and performance will be bad when they don't try hard or when they're sloppy. And so if you have that implicit theory, then you believe it will work to just scare them enough. No mistakes allowed. Okay, that'll make people try harder, and then there'll be no mistakes and no failures. And of course, in a complex, uncertain environment, that's just not how it works.
It's interesting, right? Because you see, I often wonder about business schools, if business schools should not kind of be almost more vertical, right? We are teaching management 101. And then, well, some people of you will manage a supermarket, others an assembly line, and others like a lab. And it's like, no, this is completely different, right?
Yeah.
So,
although learning should be a thread that runs through all of them. It just will look different. But if the central goal is to embed learning in everything we do, say as Toyota tries to do, or as a well-run medical center tries to do, or as an R&D laboratory tries to do, then there'll be certain mental models that will actually be similar across.
Yeah. Amy, there was one line in the book. My understanding, my limited understanding of Harvard Business School is that you start out as an expert in an area, but the more senior you become, the more broader, right? In your if you gave me a business card, it actually said like a professor of like general management or something like that, right? So very often it's very broad. And there's one line in the book which reminded me of this, where you say the mix of factors, and then technology, psychology, management, systems. So that is something where I thought like, oh, that is kind of reflective of the journey you go through as a Harvard Business School professor, where you probably started, I think it's fair to say, probably closer towards psychology. But then the book actually kind of goes broader. Say a little bit more about that journey and the interaction. You see, like, when I got the book, I thought like, she's going to write another book on psychological safety, but it's not a book about psychological safety. It's a book where psychological safety plays a role, but the book is much broader than that.
I agree.
Say more about that interaction.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And I think that's a fair interpretation of Harvard Business School. I don't think it's true for everyone or across the board. I mean, it's you can come here and stay very narrowly in your discipline and be happy, I promise. And to a certain extent, what you just said could be seen as a real criticism, right? That people can get way far out beyond their expertise and be making pronouncements that are too broad and too general to actually be believed. And that's a risk factor in what you said. But
I see.
Slightly different topic, but my own journey, indeed. I mean, I had an undergraduate degree in engineering, in structural engineering, which is pretty mechanical and basic. I wanted things to stand up. I wanted things to work. I think some of that thinking still runs through my work, my research, my writing, which is I just want to figure out what works. That's kind of that's the driving force. But early in my career, relatively early in my career, I discovered that people were really complicated, and that a lot of times in work environments, what wasn't working had more to do with the people than the calculations, by the engineers. And so I needed to understand it better. So I did indeed go and do a PhD in organizational behavior, really with a kind of psychology thread. And then I came to HBS and had the good fortune to be hired not by the OB department, who very specifically did not want to hire me because they didn't think that I was going to amount to anything, which was a fair bet at that time, I think. But for some unknown reason, the technology and operations management group thought I'd be a good hire, and so I got to sort of teach and live and be immersed in people who really cared about operations, which is, of course, part of my affection for the Toyota production system comes from being right here with these colleagues who cared about how things work and how people intersected with how things work. But the longer you're here at HBS, as you described, the more you're speaking to sort of not just future managers in the MBA program, but current managers in the executive programs and very senior at that, and seeing how they think and seeing where both they know a lot more than us about reality, and then also where they may get it wrong on psychology or on group dynamics and need a little help to avoid some pitfalls.
Why is the interaction between these elements, between systems and management and psychology, so important? Can you say more about that?
I think what I try to say, and not always very coherently, is that phenomena, organizational phenomena, whether you're in a hospital or a global corporation in fast-moving consumer goods or in a family, are complex. And they're complex in that they have psychological dimensions, interpersonal conversations. Sometimes I think it all comes down to conversations and where they go off the rails or not. And of course, there's technological issues and uncertainty, and so when you, I mean, it's hopelessly complex if you really. So all models are simplifications, and what we hope is that they are helpful simplifications. A model never captures reality, but it tries to call attention to aspects of reality that may help us navigate it more effectively.
Yeah. You have this beautiful term of an intelligent failure, Amy, in the book. What is an intelligent failure?
So it's intelligent. And by the way, the term was, I think, first coined by Duke professor Sim Sitkin in '92 in a paper.
Yeah, you refer to him in the book.
Strategy of small losses. Yeah.
There's a side aspect about the book that I like, that some of these kind of big thinkers of today's management world, you remember, oh, this was probably at the Academy of Management 30 years ago or something.
Exactly.
Like so you go a little bit back to these moments.
Some basics, right back to some basics.
Yeah.
But so
intelligent failure. Yeah.
Yeah, so intelligent failure is one. And by the way, of the three types of failure, intelligent failure is technically the only one that's not preventable. And that is because it is essentially the undesired result of a thoughtful experiment in new territory. And the criteria are, it's got to be new territory, right? You cannot simply look up the answer on the internet. You are in pursuit of a goal. You're not just messing about, right? There's something you hope to accomplish. You've done your homework. You've found out what we do know, what we don't know. And then that gives you a hypothesis about what's worth testing, where you hope you're right. Again, we all do, but we aren't always. And then Fourth, and most important, perhaps, or most easily missed, no bigger than it has to be, right? So our experiments in new territories should be just big enough to get new knowledge, but no, not so big that we really waste resources or potentially cause harm that we didn't have to cause. And by those criteria, you necessarily are learning something useful that helps you progress toward a valued goal.
I wanted to share two thoughts about the intelligent failures with you, and they are not quoted in the book, and unless I missed them, it's not from your studies. There's a paper by Michela Stan and Freck Vermeulen, Selection at the Gate. I don't know if you happen to be familiar with the paper. The paper is beautiful in the following sense. They look at the British healthcare system, and at some point, the British healthcare system basically evaluated hospitals according to like their death rate, basically, like how many of the patients died. And so some hospitals immediately started gaming this.
Right.
And okay, if we want to look better in these ratings, here's a category of patient we really don't want to have. So if you have this kind of heart condition, please don't come to us because probably you're gonna die. And this makes us look in the ratings. Why don't you go to the neighbor city? Okay.
Right.
And so what they find that there are some hospitals who, by contrast, embrace these difficult cases. And it turns out that they actually, in the long term, do phenomenally well.
Wow.
Because they learn the most from the difficult cases.
God.
So they look bad in the short term. Okay. But they look really, they look very bad in the short term, but they're basically saying, like, bring me the difficult cases, right? And so they make themselves look really bad in the long term, but it's a hospital, it's gonna survive, like there's economic pressure, but they're gonna stay around.
Yeah.
But then they learn so much from the difficult cases. And to me, that was always like what I liked about that. In particular, after reading your book, I felt like these were organizations that thought out intelligent failures rather than avoiding them. They kind of went head on. I can send you the study. I feel like
I'm so sad that I didn't reference it because that's a beautiful study. That's a beautiful example. And it's emblematic of so many things that are wrong with how people think. In an uncertain world, we have to think differently, right? Because they're essentially saying, let's look at the scorecard. Okay, the scorecard blames us when people die. By the way, newsflash, we're all going to die at some point, but it blames us for having those
deaths. You need to end on a more positive note than
right now. We won't end now, right? But we're all going to. So I mean, if that's the scorecard, what do? They engineer their inputs to meet that score rather than either challenge the scorecard. By the way, what they really needed was better risk adjustment, right? It shouldn't be whether people die. It should be whether people die based on how sick they were when they came in, how challenging.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, as you say, or some embraced the opportunity to take these difficult cases, either explicitly or implicitly understanding this will make us better, right? And it's just amazing. It's an amazing story.
But see, I mean, this is something I forgot. You quote Deming at some point about that a bad system will always kind of beat good humans, right? You see, that is something where and you just alluded to it, right? We have these scorecards, right? If you're subject to one of these scorecards, you're to certain degrees, you can sometimes be forced to avoid this, right? So So Dan Leventhal and Hart Posen have a paper in ASQ, this is like 15 years ago, which they call the myopia of selection. And the whole idea is like, hey, if you select too early, you might have really good strategies in place, but if you select early on, those kind of get selected out, right? And you see, I have two young children, and I often, I remember this sounds like a joke. So I recently moved to Philadelphia for a sabbatical, and so my son has grown up with 4 languages. So I speak German with him. My wife speaks Chinese with him. He's grown up in France, and so he learned English on the side. And so before we moved to Philadelphia, the schools wanted to interview him. And he said, English is not good enough. He's not qualified. And I was like, I can totally see that you come to this conclusion on your scorecard. He's not fitting in. But
Right.
I talked to the director, wouldn't you be excited to have as one student in your school, somebody who's 4 years old, speaks like 4 languages? Oh, that would be fantastic. I'm like, yes, he's failing your test. He has already failed your test. So in that sense, Amy, how should I say, what can we do? Like are these systems not failure tolerant enough? And I mean, you know this, but you see, like, basically, this from your children, right? If your children are not perfect on the SAT, if they are like 16, 17 or something like that, they might have an enormous talent in other areas. How can we, how to say, what are things to do to kind of get organizations to have society tolerant of the right kind of failure?
There's, I think, so first I'll say, yes, I think we have many systems, in society, in management, in education, that are not failure tolerant enough, which ends up, in fact, let's put it in the positive, they're performance obsessed. And when you're performance obsessed, there are some, unintended negative consequences. Like people find, they either, teach to the test, right? They find, okay, if that's the score, we'll just go to that score, but that's not really what a good education looks like. Or
in the book you say, if you don't have the possibility of failure, you actually kind of increase the occurrence. So
you increase the future likelihood of failure, right? Because you aren't failure proofing yourself with, think about the competence that your son has with those 4 languages, already tools that he can use and will perfect. But that incredible competence almost did him in on this narrow scorecard, this scorecard that wasn't failure tolerant enough. So what are our options? Well, we can, I mean, I think we either can challenge the systems, right? Sort of bring up their shortcomings and how they are perversely incentivizing things we don't want to see in our organization or in our society. Or we can do a better job of either risk adjusting, like of making it clear, like in the case of your son, yes, English isn't as good as some of the other 4-year-olds applying, and when you sort of risk adjust it and realize that he can speak fluently in 3 other languages, suddenly you see a very different image. So those patients who were very sick needed a different way of thinking about them, so you don't cherry pick, because the cherry picking is quite problematic from a societal perspective. So either challenge and change the system, or get a better risk adjustment or more nuanced scoring system that is better matches reality, so that ultimately our long-term goals are more likely to be met.
I have said about 150% of what I know. So I would encourage the audience to actually kind of put out some questions. I have a few more things I'm eager to talk about, but I want to encourage everyone. We already have a bunch of questions in the Q&A. But if you haven't yet shared your questions, please put them in. You might also be able to upvote them. I don't know, but please feel free to answer your question. Amy, I wanted to kind of to get you think even further. I wanted to throw like one other kind of study at you, which is also very much about failure, but a little bit of a different kind. Okay. So I recently conducted a study with Fabian Gessler on the effect of chess computers. We wanted to understand, how does AI kind of change people? Okay. And so we have this beautiful experiment that chess computers became available in 1977 in Western countries, but not in the Soviet Union. So we have a very nice effect where we can see, okay, this is how AI helps people learn. And we already have a question about AI in the chat. So we find like, okay, AI helps people learn because you basically have a virtual training partner, right? Somebody who I can interact with. And so it comes out, if you have access to AI, you learn more, you have more training. But now there's one finding which I personally like a lot. When people train with AI, they generally become better. But an important part of playing chess is to recognize the mistakes of your opponent and to exploit those opponents. And when you train only with a chess computer, you never get exposed to mistakes. You never basically see mistakes. And
Right.
so you make less mistakes yourself, because every mistake you make, the chess computer will brutally exploit. But you don't see the other person making mistakes. And so you become generally better because you don't make mistakes yourself, but you're not improving really in exploiting other people's mistakes.
Yeah.
The reason why I obviously think of that study because I wrote it, but the reason why I thought of it is that I felt when you say these mistakes go underground, I felt there's a cost to that, which is not so explicit in the book, that if mistakes go underground that are not reported, then also managers don't learn how to manage them, right? It's not only that you don't pop up, right? So I had a student once who went to Walmart instead of Boston Consulting. And I said, like, why do you go to Walmart when you can go to Boston Consulting? And he said, like, at Boston Consulting, I will only be surrounded by young, smart, hardworking individuals who are motivated. I won't be able to learn how to manage, because at Walmart, I have a very, very different demographic. And I will actually learn to manage in a much, much broader level. And so I thought about
that
this.
That is an impressive student, I must say.
Yeah. Insert student. Huh? So I thought about this, right? You see, like, to be a good manager, you want to have these mistakes reported, not just to fix the problem at hand, but you see, like, if you think you're living in an error-free environment, you're not becoming a great manager.
You're right. I never thought of that. So the one part I do think about, and maybe didn't emphasize enough, or maybe did, is that when people aren't talking about mistakes, their colleagues aren't learning from them, right? So that there's this, curriculum that's missing for others when mistakes. But I hadn't really thought about then that managers don't get the opportunity to learn how to manage mistakes. How do you react in a productive way? How do you take the lessons from the mistakes to kind of failure proof a process so that that particular mistake is less likely? Because many mistakes reveal vulnerabilities in operating procedures that could be removed, the procedures could be improved. But also the manager's opportunity to get that human experience in how do you react so that it's a learning experience, not a punitive experience. I think that's very subtle and interesting.
Amy, I'm going to switch here a little bit towards the questions in the chat. So if this suddenly becomes much more interesting, you know why that is. So Jason asked a question which I thought was really interesting. And Jason asked, do you think that, how should I say, tolerance for failure within organization among managers is correlated with people's tolerance for failure outside in like their personal hobbies or interpersonal relationships? You see, like, I find the question is very good because it makes me think about what are my hobbies and how does that, any thoughts on the observation?
I'll admit right off the bat, I don't have data on that, but I think it's a good hypothesis. I mean, I imagine that people who do things in their free time that are full of error, right? If you're I don't know, sailing like I sometimes do, or playing golf or something, where you're just going to have errors all the time, like it or not, versus maybe something where you can do it with great precision in a reliable way. You may just develop those muscles for knowing that things go wrong, and then you may have a higher tolerance for failure inside. I want to relabel this idea of tolerance for failure as, if we can think about it as tolerance for reality, I think it's pretty helpful, right? Because it's not that we're tolerating sloppiness or low standards, right? It's that we're tolerating Mother Nature, you know, or the state of our technology as it is today, and the state of human beings as we are today. Like, we're just willing to go with the truth over the cover-up.
You see, there's something, this might be a little bit too much inside baseball, but one thing, so I got educated at the West Coast. I did my PhD at Stanford. And how do you find out if somebody got a PhD at Stanford? Don't worry, they will tell you. But there's something interesting about your work and the work by James March, I would say, because in many ways you never mention the word exploration, but a lot of it is exploration. But you have a different take on it, right? You see, and I think it's hard because James March was more of a model thinker, right? Who kind of thought more about like what happens in terms of probabilities, how do you operate in uncertainty? And I think one of the great accomplishments of your book, what I really like, is that it disentangles that a little bit to say, like, you know what, these mistakes happen and sometimes they don't get reported. And so you're making a great effort to say, like, look, it's not simply failure. We need to differentiate between sloppiness and uncertainty, where we could simply rule these things out. Yeah.
Right. And sometimes, you know, a third, there are probably more too, but a third category might be just, I'm not yet trained in that domain, right? So things will go wrong, but it's just because I'm a novice, not because I'm sloppy, or not because an expert person would be able to do better. But you still have to let me learn, or I'll never be an expert.
Svetlana had a question. Now I wish we could just kind of zoom in like Zeke Hernandez and Bill Kerr into this. She has a question about immigrants, and so she asked, the failing on the scorecard is a situation to which all immigrants can attest while moving to another country and facing new cultural professional environments. Basic example: not being able to bond, talking about sports, about the colleagues. Do you think? No, I can attest to this.
I agree.
Like Kathy Eisenhart was talking about American football all the time, and I had no clue what she was talking about.
Yeah, I have no clue either, but don't tell anybody.
We better get ready for the Super Bowl on Sunday. Right. Do you think, can you say about kind of this selection for immigrants, or like how should I say, how immigration is obviously not a topic of your book, but I like the question because it feels very much as if immigrants might fail like in intelligent ways to a certain degree, but it's not necessarily tolerated or so, but I leave it up to you.
Well, I love the question because it shows a real listening to our conversation, and it builds on what your story, and it builds on some of the ideas in the book. So it's a you know, for sure, Svetlana didn't come into this webinar with that question. She had to be here to come up with it. So it shows that thinking and curiosity, which I love. And I hadn't been asked that question before, and it makes me think. And what I'm thinking is, yes, it's true. Like, yes, it's a problem. There's a scorecard that immigrants, and sometimes, you know, women, or, you know, depends, you know, anyone from a different culture coming into a new culture will not get some of what's going on. And there's no magic solution for that. So to me, the solution, or at least the path forward, is make it discussable, make it explicit. Like, let's sort of, because so much of this is taken for granted, tacit knowledge that people are bonding over. And I don't want to put the burden on the immigrants. I want to help everybody sort of think, you know, what about our community here, our organization, or whatever it is makes access less available for those who are not already part of this community. And just, you know, to make it kind of be anthropological yourself and say, what are we inadvertently doing that may shut others out? I mean, I think it's something that has to be raised to be resolved.
Mohammed has a question which I like a lot. You see, like, I think we can all see let me frame it a little bit, the advantages of like an organization that is kind of is psychological safe, encourages psychological and encourages intelligent failure. But not all of us have the privilege of being in such kind of environments. And so he asked the question, how can you convince management to embrace that? I do, by the way, want to, in that context, because we discussed 2 weeks ago Bob Sutton's book, and Bob Sutton has one thing in his book which I think is just fantastic. He has a pyramid in this book. I don't have it right now here. He has a pyramid in his book where he says, the book is, by the way, called The Friction Project. It just came out, if you want to read it, where he talks about what different peoples in different layers of the hierarchy can do to make the organ to address friction. So he says, like, this is what the bottom layer can do.
Right.
This is what the top system layer can do. And so Mohammed's question made me think of Bob's book in that sense.
I would say something similar to that, which is act where you are. And that's because that's the only thing you can do. And perhaps the way you framed the goal will not get you where you want to be. So you framed it as, how do we convince management? It's very hard to convince anyone of anything, right? My flippant answer would be give them the book, right? Then they'll be all set. But more truthfully and seriously, all you can really do, and I believe this matters, is act where you are. So call attention to uncertainty in your role, in your team. Don't worry about them. They'll get there eventually, or they won't. At a certain point, there isn't much you can really do about it, but you can make such an enormous difference with your colleagues in talking about things in a more realistic, scientific, thoughtful way that will allow people to take smart risks and also help them avoid stupid risks, and help them deliver good performance in known territory.
There's a fantastic question by Jessica. Did you consider cultural, generational, or gender nuances in your study? And I was thinking about this, like, it doesn't pop up. The insights are very general. So in a certain way, I appreciated that it didn't come up, but it was nevertheless a question of my mind, whether there are contingencies based upon gender.
Well, the one, you're right. It's absolutely not a focus. There's no chapters on, it's not a focus of the book. The book, I think it probably reflects my, engineering brain, right? That I want to figure out what works, and I want to explain it as clearly as I can. I do, in the last chapter, talk about the unequal license to fail, so that the very things that we talk about, that I talk about, that others have talked about in terms of smart failure and fail fast, fail often, whether you're an entrepreneur or a scientist or so forth, can feel out of reach or less in reach for people of color, in some settings for women, for anyone who is whose group is in a minority in that category of activity, let's say senior scientists or senior executives, etc. They are and will be more visible, and they will feel and be seen by others in ways that are consistent with this, less able, less able to recover from failure, right? So less than therefore able to take smart risks. I think that is true. That's not my research. That's kind of established in other people's work. The one gender difference that I've studied more systematically with my wonderful friend and former student Jim Dietert was sort of implicit theories about speaking up at work. Women, and the only one, we studied 6 of them, the only 6 implicit theories, the only one where women have a statistically significant difference, and it's lower, is the one, the sort of the willingness to speak up without, really solid data or confidence that what you're going to say is right. That one shows a gender difference. And that is related to what we're talking about here, because it is related to sort of taking risks without all the ducks being lined up in a row, that there may be a gender difference there, but I think more research is needed.
Mani Wessels has a very, very honest, very insightful question. Would you have any comments on managing the impact of self-confidence and doubt and in resilience in pursuit of long-term goals when there are periods of failure, probably more frequent and severe, the higher one aims? Like, you see, like I have a high goal, I'm in a failure environment, I'll go through that. I go through that failure period.
Yeah.
You do a little bit of this in the book, right? You see, now you are Amy Edmondson, and you're kind of like, no, I fail at sailing. I'm the one person who didn't get picked on the basketball team. So you're framing,
and my first study failed, right? My first research study failed. Yep. And then it succeeded in a funny way. Well, you know,
I had a paper on rejection, which got rejected.
Oh, that's terrible. Terrible. Ironic. So I think that the grit, you know, the work on grit and the work on growth mindset are both relevant here. That resilience comes from, I mean, it's not just how much failure, it is how you think about, how you respond to the failures that you do have, and how we think is, you know, and I talk about this in chapter 5 of the book of, you know, you have to learn productive self-talk in the face of setbacks. It's not something you will, well, some people have more of it than others as kids and so forth, but you can learn it, and most of us have to learn it to kind of be, to try to welcome the information that's brought by this disappointing experience, put it to good use, and drive forward. But I think it helps. I wrote a little piece recently, sort of, you know, related to the book, but on, I think, just to make it super simple, like the most successful among us have failed more often, not less often than others, right? So it's, you know, whether you're a scientist, a celebrity chef, a elite athlete, you have been willing. So when we look out at those kind of role models or case studies, we realize, okay, yeah, well, if they did it, you know, if those greats were willing and able to fail and then succeed so well, maybe that helps, right? Maybe that helps me feel okay as well.
Amy, Elizabeth Barrett has a great question. She talks about like the failure tolerance in organizations. And so she points out, you see, like she makes it sound almost a little bit generational. I don't think it's meant generational, but like there's failure tolerance or the understanding that failure occurs sometimes in like on the lower levels and in middle management who actually knows the system. But the top management, who's sometimes potentially not even familiar anymore with the everyday in and out of these kind of things, has no tolerance for failure.
Yeah.
Is that something you observe? And the more important question, how do you deal with it?
Well, you know, there's a great sort of line, and I won't be able to quote it, but it is, you know, the operators are worried, you know, and then the supervisors are like, you know, okay, and the managers or whatever. By the time you get to the executives, they are absolutely blissful, right? Because, you know, the closer you are to where the work is being done, the more you see the things that are going wrong, as well as the things going right. And so it is often the case that the more senior folks in the organization are shielded from the truth, you know, about reality. So their tolerance for failure can be low because they simply aren't being exposed to it. Now, I think that's not the best way to run an organization, but another element here is that they are most visible. People, if something goes south, people are looking to them. They will be seen as responsible at the broadest level. You know, so there's a lot of pressure and stress that they're going to feel in those roles that will contribute to being intolerant to failure. But the great ones, the Ed Catmull's, founder and CEO of Pixar, will sort of, they know things can go wrong, and they know that how they react to things going wrong is absolutely critical to the future success of the company. So I think even if you will see, and I think you would be able to document main effects based on level, you would also likely see enough variance to be interesting.
Amy, the hour is done. I could go way on. There are unfortunately many questions in the chat that I haven't asked. I've tried to weave in as many as I could early on in my comments now more explicitly, but I excused everyone whose question I did not ask. I sometimes skip the questions, by the way, which I felt are most explicitly answered in the book. So I focused on questions where I felt like, even if you read the book, this might be an ongoing question. So the questions I've skipped, I would highly, highly encourage to get the book. Amy, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Really pleasure.
And thanks to everyone who joined us. The next guest we have is, I believe, in 2 weeks from now, I believe February 27th, but I need to look it up, is Katie Milkman from the, here we go. Katie Milkman from the Wharton Business School, How to Change. So if your problem is you eat too many carbs, you don't do enough exercise, or you know somebody who eats too many carbs or doesn't do enough exercise, this is really for you to join. Katie's absolutely fantastic. So I hope to see you in 2 weeks. And again, once more, Amy, thanks so much. All righty.
Bye-bye.